Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Professor Michael Bailey, Chair of the Department of Government, Ron Klain, and Kevin Spacey.
Good evening. My name is Michael Bailey. I'm the chair of the Department of Government, and I'd like to welcome you to the Sullivan Lecture on Ethics in Government. This lecture is designed to help students confront the ethical issues that they have faced and will face as they work in the policy world on Capitol Hill, in the executive branch, at state level, or as engaged citizens. So we have here at Georgetown a simple ambition, and that ambition is that when someone meets a Georgetown graduate, they know that that student, that person, does things ethically. So that nothing makes us prouder than when someone says something like, "She's from Georgetown, she'll do it the right way." So this shared ethical approach to public service arises in part from conversations like this. So they begin here in Gaston, continue in classes, continue in dorms, continue on M Street, continue wherever the world takes us. So before we begin, I'd like to thank Dan and Sheila Sullivan for their generosity and support. Dan is graduated from Georgetown, both undergraduate and law degree, served in Vietnam, and had a distinguished career as an attorney in the financial services. So thank you, Dan and Sheila. I'd also like to offer a special welcome to those who've expressed interest in the MA programs in the Department of Government. We have programs in American government, conflict resolution, and democracy and governance. Information on the programs and the degrees is available at the tables outside. Please feel free to stop by and say hello. I'd also like to thank Anthony Eames, Mahila David, Colleen Litkenhouse, and the students from the Lecture Fund for their hard work in setting up this event. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome our two guests. So Kevin Spacey may be best known to many of us for our binges of House of Cards. He is, of course, the star and producer of the series, and it's about Frank Underwood, an ethically challenged majority whip in the House of Representatives. The series has received 9 Emmy nominations. One reviewer noted that House of Cards is a wonderfully sour take on power and corruption. I should note, however, though, after what we've seen on Capitol Hill the past few weeks, some of us go back to the series for a feel-good pick-me-up about our national legislature. Kevin, of course, has done much more than House of Cards. He's won Oscars for The Usual Suspects and American Beauty. And starred in Casino Jack, Margin Call, Pay It Forward, Shipping News, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, LA Confidential, and much more. He's also had success in the theater, recently starring in a production of Shakespeare's Richard III. A New York Times reviewer, writing 10 months before the 2012 presidential election, wrote, "Mr. Romney, have you met Richard, Duke of Gloucester? You might benefit from a sit-down with the title character of Richard III, or the version of him that is being embodied with all-conquering audacity by Kevin Spacey. In Shakespeare's grisly portrait of the hunchback who would be king, Richard buzzsaws his way through a crowded field of contenders to the crown of England. Now, Mr. Romney might find some of Richard's stratagems déjà vu, like having other people besmirch your rivals' reputations, or unfeasible in these civilized times, like hiring assassins to dispatch competitors. But Mr. Romney should definitely make close study of at least one aspect of Mr. Spacey's star turn, as Shakespeare's poisonous, bunch-backed toad. For this Richard, the cardinal rule of how to succeed in politics is clear. You have to outact everybody else. If Mr. Romney devotes half the flair and energy to this proposition that Mr. Spacey does, you can start playing Hail to the Chief. Now, as we know, as it turns out, Mr. Romney did not get that copy of the New York Times and is not have Hail to the Chief played as he enters the room. So one of Kevin's roles was to play our other guest, Ron Klain, in the movie Recount, about the 2000 election dispute between Al Gore and George W. Bush in Florida. Now, in introducing Ron, we first need to know he's a Georgetown College graduate. He's also an adjunct professor here in the government department. And as if that's not enough, there is more. Here's how HBO described Ron when discussing the character that Kevin Spacey was playing in the movie Recount. Klain was considered a legal and political prodigy. He graduated from Georgetown and earned a magna cum laude degree from Harvard Law School before clerking for Supreme Court Justice Byron White. By 1994, he was chief of staff and counselor to Attorney General Janet Reno, and Time magazine named him one of the 50 most promising leaders in America under 40. He became assistant to President Clinton and then chief of staff and counselor to Al Gore in 1995. Since then, Ron has served as chief of staff to Vice President Joe Biden and has served as a senior White House aide to President Obama. Now, both our guests tonight have volunteered to show up here, and we're very grateful for this chance to listen in on and then join a conversation about ethics, the ethics of power and its uses. So they're going to have a conversation, and then we will open the floor to questions. So please join me in welcoming Kevin Spacey and Ron Klain.
Thank you, Mike. I fully expected tonight to be upstaged at my alma mater. I did not expect to be out Georgetown at my alma mater. So there you go. As Mike said, our topic tonight is, what are you going to do? Our topic tonight is politics, ethics, policy. And, you know, usually at Georgetown, we study that through the study of classic texts, historical texts. But tonight, we're going to look at those same questions through the prism of the performing arts, and in particular, through the many roles that our very special guest, Kevin Spacey, has played. And we'll start, of course, with the role on everyone's mind, I think the most interesting character in popular culture today that raises questions about ethics, politics, and policy, Frank Underwood. Kevin's outstanding, amazing star turn in the paradigm-shifting hit series for Netflix. And I'd like to start with current events. As Mike alluded to, we're here in Washington, where the overwhelming spirit is a Congress of dysfunction, gridlock, partisanship, nothing gets done. And when you think about House of Cards, by comparison, and Frank Underwood specifically, there are two differences with reality that leap out at you. The first is how incredibly effective Frank Underwood is in getting things done. As the House of Cards Twitter feed recently said, quote, House of Cards is obviously a fictional show because it features a Congress that gets shit done. That's the first thing. The second, of course, are the incredibly underhanded, unacceptable, and horrific tactics that Frank Underwood uses to get those things done. That would never be acceptable. So, Kevin, I want to start there, which is, do you think the message of House of Cards is the ends justify the means, that you need to be like Frank Underwood to get things done?
You know, when I was invited to come here tonight, and I was delighted because we have a friendship, and I had the great honor of playing you in a film. I was absolutely, I'd love to come and do this evening. And then when I heard it was a conversation about ethics in politics, and I played Jack Abramoff, and now I'm playing Frank Underwood, I thought, this is going to be a really fucking brief night. But putting the irony aside, I was very interested that Kevin McCarthy, who is the current majority whip in the House, had said something to me privately, because he and Steny Hoyer were very generous in letting me come to the Capitol and spend some time with them to learn about what it actually is to whip, in Kevin's case, 218 congressmen and women. But he said to me privately something that then, like a week later, he said publicly, and I was actually kind of shocked he said it publicly. He said, well, you know, if I could just murder one member of Congress, I wouldn't have to worry about another vote. And of course, then the speculation began, well, who would that member be? Do the ends justify the means? It's a really, I think, an important question to ask. Let me put it, try to answer it in this context. I was very interested and intrigued when I watched the film Lincoln, because I thought it was an extraordinary performance by Daniel Day-Lewis. But what I also thought was one of the most interesting aspects of the film was that the writer and Steven Spielberg, the director, and clearly the company of actors, were very interested in exploring that side of Abraham Lincoln, who has, without question, probably become our most sainted president, beloved, looked at as an extraordinary man of intelligence and compassion. And then you look at what he was willing to do politically to end slavery. Yes, I'm absolutely certain that if those events had been happening today, CNN would be breaking news that the president had done these terrible, horrible things in giving away posts and assigning people to positions in government simply to get their vote, because at the end of the day, in his mind, it was more important to pass that legislation and to end slavery than if he appointed somebody to something. So I look at a case like that and I say, well, that was a really interesting exploration of examining a part of Lincoln as a politician that I thought was a very valuable lesson. I came away from that going, wow, they humanized him, and they were not unafraid to say these things he was willing to do in order to get shit done. And I think that's admirable. Now, obviously House of Cards is a dramatic series, and we're doing things for dramatic effect. But it has been very interesting for me to go around talking to people and talking to audiences, and because I can be around in the political world, and I've sort of been around in politics most of my life, it's very interesting that the very question you just asked is one that audiences are grappling with. Do the ends justify the means? At a time when we're watching maybe the most paralyzed government we've had in quite a long time. And I think maybe there are other politicians from history that were viewed as ruthless, very, very difficult, in your face, and would do dirty, dirty, nasty things, who are being re-examined. I think Lyndon Johnson is being re-examined as a politician. A lot of people thought he was the toughest son of a bitch that ever walked the face of the earth. But he got 3 civil rights bills passed in a very short presidency. There's something to examine about that.
Well, let's dig into that a little more. So, as you mentioned, I know you've talked to both Kevin McCarthy and Steny Hoyer about how they do their jobs and the ethics of arm twisting and what they can and can't do. And as far as I know, neither has ever killed a member of Congress. It's very good. There's some limits there. But I know you've also been around Washington a long time. When I talk to people from outside of Washington about House of Cards, my friends from outside of Washington all say the same thing. Please, Ron, tell me it's not really that bad. And so, what's your perspective from having talked to Hoyer, talked to McCarthy, been on the Hill, talked to these guys? Do you think, House of Cards obviously is an extreme version, a dystopian version of Washington, but how much real Washington is in there, and how much of real Washington do you think about as you develop Frank Underwood?
Whether they might say this publicly or not publicly, I have talked to more people who were in politics who've said to me, it's closer than you can imagine. It's the most accurate description of how politics actually works that we've ever seen. I mean, West Wing, beautiful, wonderful idea of how democracy should work, but I've had more people in politics say they think House of Cards is closer. I don't know whether to take that as a compliment or a sad state of affairs. I'm not sure.
Well, in terms of that, one thing I'm struck by about House of Cards is that it's not just Frank who does all these horrible and awful things. Virtually every major character on the show, Zoe, Claire, all use completely unethical means to achieve their power in not just politics, but journalism, nonprofit advocacy, in the case of your wife on the show. And when I talk to people about the show, what is interesting is that most of the viewers of the show, most of the time, are rooting for these characters to succeed, notwithstanding the tactics they use. So what do you think that says about us as an audience, that we want to see these bad people get their way?
We're all fucked up. Look, you're asking this question as if you've not been in a position to watch this fucking shit go down directly. Now, you and I, when we first met, I was playing you in a film that was an examination of what happened in the year 2000 when we didn't know who the president was for 46 days?
36 days.
36 days.
Not that anyone counted.
Yeah. The shit that went down in that experience was some of the most extraordinarily mind-boggling manipulation. I mean, sometimes here's my feeling. I watch what's going on in Washington, and I think to myself, our scripts are not that fucking crazy. They're really not. I looked at that experience. I mean, half of the time when we were doing Recount, it was so funny. I mean, the situations were so ridiculously funny that you couldn't write them. I mean, of course they actually happened. And when I viewed that whole experience, when we had such an incredible time making that film and the response to that film, I mean, you have to say, yes, it does happen. People do behave in unethical ways to succeed and to gain power.
Well, let's talk about that a bit, and we'll come back to House of Cards, but let's detour over to Recount for a minute, which is, I think there's an interesting question in that film about really who is acting ethically. So there's a lot at stake in the Recount. And obviously I'm going to show my political bias here, but no surprise. But
I was leading you toward
Thank you, I appreciate that, Kevin. So, but because in the end George Bush became president, a lot of things happened that a lot of us think shouldn't have happened in the country. And so I guess you can look at Recount through one of two, the film and the actual events, through one of two ethical perspectives. One is that the Bush campaign was willing to use tactics in the Recount that the Gore campaign didn't. Maybe that's an ethical plus for the Gore campaign. The other perspective would be, with so much on the line, the Gore campaign should have been more aggressive and done more things to actually win. And your character, me, definitely in the film at least, seemed to be very frustrated by the constraints that were placed on him in his pursuit of victory in Florida.
I actually thought that frustration was just the fact that it wasn't Brad Pitt playing you instead of me.
I could not have done better. Thank you very much. But sometimes in these high-stake things, not fighting hard enough may be the less ethical choice.
No, there's no question that at the end of that film, the character I played, you, wanted to continue the fight and didn't want to give up. But then you also have the ethical question, was it correct for the United States Supreme Court to become involved in a case in which I do believe constitutionally it is Congress that resolves presidential disputes, correct?
Yeah.
And what's most interesting, you want to talk ethically for a second, about the Supreme Court decision is that for the first time in its history, it was not a precedent. It was a one-time only judgment, meaning you could never reflect back in any other case to the Gore versus Bush case. You couldn't do it. It was like, we know this is wrong, but we're doing it. And the whole question of whether the Supreme Court should have taken that case, to me, is an ethical one. Thank you and good night. Thank you.
Yeah. See, now Kevin's getting me really angry here. But, and for the record, I should say, Justice Scalia a couple years ago gave a speech where his basic message to people at Bush v. Gore was that we should just get over it, and I'm not over it, just to be clear about that. But I do want to go back to House of Cards for a second. And, you know, one of the things we often hear in Washington is that for things to get done, people in power have to be men and women of their word, and their promise has to be their bond. And there's two quotes from House of Cards that I love on this topic. The first comes in the first episode of the show where a promise made to you by the president is broken. And you're outraged about that. And you go to the president's chief of staff and you say, the nature of promises, Linda, is that they remain immune to changing circumstances. Mm-hmm. Then it turns out a few episodes later, as Frank Underwood is trying to get things done, he may stretch a few promises along the way and maybe a little less dedicated to the idea of promises. And when he's confronted on this, he says, quote, I have revised the parameters of my promise.
And your problem is?
Well, I don't know. You tell me. Should I have a problem with that? Should we have a problem with that?
It's politics, baby.
Yeah? Well,
I mean, you know, it is true, isn't it? I mean, we've just been through a situation that I think was at least spearheaded by a promise that was made that then couldn't be delivered on. Right. And I believe that was Boehner saying, yes, we have a deal, and then, oh, no, I can't deliver that deal, and, oh, let's shut down the government. Let's just do that. So we do seem to be existing in a time when that very thing is happening, and I would say simply that welcome to the world of human contradiction.
Indeed. So I want to detour for a second away from ethics and politics to ask you a question, which is, we've talked about some of these roles here tonight, Jack Abramoff and Richard III. I want to talk to you more in a second, and of course Frank Underwood. Is it just a coincidence that in the recent years you've played three characters so involved in politics, so active in politics, and a bit on the shady side ethically? Or is this
really? I wouldn't say Ron Klain was on the shady side.
Well, you never know. So, but
yeah.
But what is there something that draws you to these roles as you make your choice as an actor? You obviously could play any part you wanted to play. What is it about this sort of drama, these political dramas, particularly these political dramas about ethics, good guy or bad guy, that attracts you as an actor?
Well, I suppose it's that I'm not only drawn to doing classical work in the theater, like Richard III and work like that, but I am quite interested in what we're grappling with, you know, what is going on in our world. And you know, sometimes you're just sort of trying to explore an idea or tell a story that you think is worth telling. And in the last couple of years, you're right, but you know, with Recount and And I'd even say Margin Call, which is a film about
exactly.
the collapse of the banking industry, and House of Cards, and then playing Jack Abramoff, who was a lobbyist that some of you may have heard of. That I am very interested in having the experience of being able to get into something and to try to, I guess in a sense, what I feel my job is not to judge the characters that I play, but to play them and to not, even in many cases, give my opinion about what I think a character is like that I play, or do I think he's a good guy or a bad guy, or, you know, I like to be able to try to do the best job that I can in telling a story and allowing the audience to be the ones who make up their minds about how they feel. And I think that in some ways, theater and film is a great opportunity for all of us to reflect and to experience something, or to become informed about something that we maybe didn't know or was not something we paid too much attention to. So I am deliberately walking toward things that are about our time and what we're going through, because it's fascinating for me, and I'm grappling through these issues too. And one of the great joys about doing House of Cards, and the experiences I've never done a series before, is that I'm still learning, you know? It's not that I show up every day and I go, oh yeah, I know this Frank Underwood guy. I show up every day and I'm discovering Frank Underwood, because as we go on, and as and the head writers, and Bo Willimon, who's our main writer, and David Fincher, who's been so incredible and hugely involved in every episode, I'm learning as we go along about this man, and he's a fascinating character, so yes, I am deliberately interested in things that are, and whether that's films that I'm in or films that I'm not in, because Captain Phillips, which is a film that's out now, I produced, and Social Network I produced, because those were stories that I felt had not been told and had not been tackled.
Well, let's go talk about Richard III for a second. And as Mike mentioned, you gave an unbelievably acclaimed performance both in London and New York, Richard III. You know, I'm a government major. A lot of people here are government majors. We may not have really studied Richard III that carefully along the way. So maybe it would be worth you sharing a little bit of how Richard III comes to power.
He kills everybody.
Yeah.
Including the kids. Richard, for those of you who don't know, Richard III is a character that was born deformed. And there are many different actors that have played Richard over the years and done different kinds of things. In our production, I had a sort of a leg brace and twisted my leg in, and I had a hump, and I had a withered hand and a cane, and it was just fucking horrible to do this every night. My body had to be like a pretzel every night. And we did this production in 12 cities around the world, and by the end, we did 198 performances. And it's a wonder they didn't find my bones in a fucking parking lot somewhere. And Richard is a character who has learned to take those things that others view as disabilities and turn them into weapons. And his quest for power, after having spent his whole life as being the sort of freak in his family and been called every name in the book, and his mother telling him that people screamed at his birth because he was born with teeth. He's a character who seeks revenge and seeks power and kills his brothers and kills his nephews, and then is quite an interesting story, because once you then get into the latter part of the play, he suddenly becomes a man who feels he has no conscience whatsoever and is suddenly confronted with one late in the play, and begins to see himself the way that others see him for the first time. And it's this little tiny window, this one scene in the play after he has a nightmare where all of the ghosts of all of the people that he's killed to become king visit him. And it's a very interesting notion of a character like Richard III, who you know, House of Cards is based on Richard III, for those of you who don't know, to some degree. If that's for me, I'm not in. The direct address, which we do in House of Cards, where Francis turns to the camera and talks to the viewer, is the device that Shakespeare created. It's different than a monologue. Because in a monologue, you know, if you're watching Hamlet on stage, it's generally an actor talking to the whole theater. But in direct address, you're talking specifically, you're looking right into the eyes of your audiences. And what was one of the most interesting aspects of doing Richard III in terms of preparing for House of Cards was that experience of going around the world. We went, you know, as far as Beijing and Istanbul and Doha, we went to a lot of incredible cities, and watching how an audience, the glee in people's faces, because you were sharing with them something that nobody else knew. That no one on the stage knew. So you could be going, watch this. I'm going to go fucking do this thing. Let's see if I get away with it. And then he'd go and do it, and he'd go, can you fucking believe that worked? So what was really incredible for me in terms of preparing for House of Cards was because I'm just looking down the barrel of a lens now, but my memory of those 198 performances, of seeing how audiences responded and reacted, and then, quite interestingly, as the play goes on, and they're like rooting him on, the same thing you talked about earlier, it's like suddenly then he kills the kids, and they're like, oh shit, we've been fucking rooting this guy on. He's horrible. And you're like, he was horrible from the beginning. So what's been interesting about that relationship, and in a way I kind of treat the direct addresses in House of Cards, I kind of think of the camera as my best friend. Because we've all been in the situation where, like, let's say we're sitting in a cafe, and somebody comes in who you sent an email to 6 days ago, and they haven't fucking written you back, right? And you're like, what? She's going to walk over, and she's going to say, oh, I'm so sorry. Right? So she walks over, and she goes, oh, I'm so sorry, and you go like this. All you have to do is look at your friend. And in many ways, that's what the experience of doing House of Cards has been like, is like, I just imagine that it's my best friend that you're saying things to that you wouldn't say to anybody. But it was those audiences in all those cities that really taught me about that relationship and how it will do this thing where they'll be rooting for you and then, oh my God, I can't believe I was rooting for you. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did, but I have another one.
There's a coffee.
Yeah, no, we're not done yet.
I'll be right back. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a deal with Starbucks.
Did you bring one of those for everyone?
No, fuck off.
Okay. So I want to talk about.
We're losing them in the balcony. They're going. They've had it.
We're leaving.
I'm out of here.
So I want to talk about what motivates Richard to seek power and whether or not how much of that carries over into House of Cards. So in Richard's famous opening monologue, he says, after talking about his deformities, and therefore, since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these farewell spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain.
And hate the idle pleasures of these days.
Thank you. So much better done than me reading it. So a lot of people look at that and say, he was predestined to villainy. It's a compulsion. What he does is compelled by his character. I think a lot of people look at Frank Underwood and kind of feel the same way. It's deep inside him, it's compelled. If it's a compulsion, if it's part of his character, is it really fair to make an ethical judgment about these people? Is this just who they are and it really isn't an ethical question? It's a question of nature and something deep inside them that they really can't control?
Well, I think that, you know, look, we are all products of our experience, and not just our past experience, but the experience we're having now will affect us later. And so I think that in some cases, like with Richard III, and in many ways like with Frank Underwood, they are responding to things that are occurring. They are shifting and moving. It's not like, you know, they woke up one day and said, I'm evil and I'm going to slice my way through the world. There is there is in the case of Underwood, I believe, an absolute clear trajectory. And it is, for me, it feels like I'm in the middle of a championship chess match with a grandmaster, and you've got to be 16 moves ahead. You have to be smarter than everyone. And so there are things that are happening that I think make people make choices. I mean, one of the things that Richard III has and Frank Underwood has is that very thing of, I just got away with that. I can't believe I got away with that. I think that emboldens a character to then go another step and then go another step. I mean, this is what we always see in politics, we see it in the entertainment business, where people get too big for their britches, they get too much money, they get too much power, they get too much leverage, and they either burn out or people start to smell it, from a mile away. And careers can be destroyed, and we see it all the time, the sort of levels of excess and hubris and just downright craziness. And some of it always, I think, man, these people just wanted to get caught. You just wanted to get caught. You knew you were bad, and so you wanted to get caught.
Yeah, so Frank Underwood's doing all this to become vice president. Has anyone explained to him what it's like to be vice president?
You still feel that way after Cheney? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know. It's a lot of effort to become vice president.
Yeah, I suppose. But then again, I don't think Frank will be your typical vice president.
Well, there you go. One certainly hopes. I do want to ask you a question or two about Jack Abramoff, Casino Jack, the role we mentioned earlier. I don't want to skate by it completely. For those of you who aren't familiar with the story of Jack Abramoff and certainly the focus of Casino Jack, he was a Washington lobbyist who came to prominence in the 1990s, and his major representation was of Native American tribes that owned casinos, and got it in their minds that what they wanted to do was to keep other Native American tribes from opening casinos and legal casinos from opening. Jack's particular genius, if you will, was getting the idea that he could use money from the tribes to hire conservative activists to be anti-gambling and help shut down other casinos and thereby protect the value of his clients' casinos. Now, the whole thing kind of, as portrayed in Casino Jack, seems disgusting. But the amazing thing is that Jack Abramoff went to jail not for that, but for actually overcharging his clients for doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what does that tell us about what that gets things done in Washington and where there are lines or rules in Washington?
Well, the thing that Casino Jack taught me more than anything is that, like everything, follow the money. And it is the money that has, in many ways, I think, put the big brick in ethics and politics in lots and lots of ways. When you, I think, force someone to go out and raise money to be able to put television ads on television to compete in a national or a state election, and there are no sort of guidelines over those ads in terms of whether they have to be accurate or truthful or anything else, that they're not put on television as a public service, then we will always have a problem in politics, because it will always be about how much money can I raise to run my next campaign. And it seems to me until the money comes out, that's not going to get solved. And as long as politicians are the ones who are supposed to do the reform, that's probably not going to happen either.
Well, and in fact, Casino Jack begins and ends as a dramatic device with Jack Abramoff writing a letter to President Obama suggesting that he, Jack Abramoff, should be put in charge of political reform because he knows what's so bad about the system.
Yeah.
One, do you think rule breakers understand the rules better than anyone else? And two, does that mean that Frank Underwood should be chair of the House Ethics Committee?
He'd get shit done on that.
He would get shit done. Yeah, yeah.
I can't remember your question, sorry.
There you go. No, Casino Jack and his role as a reformer.
Oh, as a reformer, you know, I mean, we have countless cases where we see the very people that shouldn't be in charge of something are in charge of something. It's like, you know, no, you stole from me. Why would I then say I want you to make sure that you guard my safe? Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily choose that. I think they can be very helpful, and I believe Jack Abramoff has a radio show now.
Yeah.
So he's able to put his views out there.
Well, let me wrap up my part of this before we go to the audience with one last question, which is we talked in a very lighthearted way about the ethics, the morality of House of Cards and what it says about politics, but it is largely an audience of college students here tonight, and I want to give you a chance to kind of get on your high horse a little bit if you want to, and talk about what you really think about. I know you've been incredibly active and devoted to politics and public service and political activism. You know, what are the ethics you hope today's generation of college students have about public service and politics, whether or not they're well reflected by Frank Underwood in your dramatic work?
I believe in public service. I think it's an extraordinary thing when someone decides that they want to become involved in their community and in their state and in their country, and to try to help those that are in a much more difficult situation. I think there's a lot that must turn people off about politics, but there's also a lot of really incredible things that can be done, and I think that we can always do it in small ways, in you know, whether it's working for something we believe in a charitable organization, or trying to organize something for somebody who needs some help, or even going out and trying to encourage people to vote and to become involved rather than becoming cynical and not involved. I think that the thing that people need to be careful of is believing, as we often see and often hear, that a single politician is speaking for the majority of the American public. We hear this sort of constantly. I'm speaking for the American people. And I always think to myself, when do you ever have fucking time to see the American people? You know, how many people do you actually talk to that you're not raising money from? So I think that is horseshit. But I do believe in it, and I believed in it from the time I was stuffing envelopes for Jimmy Carter when I was in junior high and high school, and you know, over the years, I've done a lot of things over the years for the Democratic Party, and I really do believe in it. I really do believe that it can be such an incredible force for good. I've always been a big believer that it's our responsibility when we get to a place where if we've done well in the business we wanted to do well in, then it's our obligation to spend a good part of our time sending the elevator back down. That's just our job. That's just what we should do. So I believe in it, and you know, it's been fascinating for me to work on the series. It's been sort of incredible for me to sort of be in Washington and sort of meeting all of these various politicians and asking hard questions to them about why can't we get it to work. It's a pretty incredible idea, what we can accomplish and what we can do. But as long as we live in a world where ideology will lead over the notion of working together or compromise, because that's the thing that I think we all can look back at history and say, what are the most incredible times where we've passed things and gotten things done? It's when people work together and they compromise. They were willing to say, I'm not going to get everything I want. And so I hope that those kind of smart and intelligent people will go into politics, and all this other stuff will fade away someday.
Excellent. Well, I know we have many of those smart, intelligent people here in the hall, so we're going to go to let the audience ask some questions now, and there's a microphone right here down front, so if people would queue up behind the microphone, I will call on you and you can ask your questions. All right. So
That means you guys up there are fucked.
all right. We'll go ahead.
Hi there. My name is Joe Laposada. I'm with our campus news back here, and I am probably not the only person in this auditorium who started watching your series and then 10 hours later realized it was finished. My question for you is, why Netflix? I mean, your series is It's so highly lauded, but why didn't you pitch it to ABC or NBC? Why go straight to Netflix? Why all at once?
Well, to answer your question, we didn't just go to Netflix. We went to all the other networks except ABC, NBC, CBS, because we couldn't say some of the things we say and do some of the things we do in Family Hour. But we did. We went out to all of the broadcast networks, all of the cable networks, and we pitched the idea of the series. And everyone was interested. They thought it was a terrific original series. As I don't know, many of you know that it was a British series originally. They liked my work, they liked David Fincher's work, but they felt very strongly that they wanted us to do a pilot. Now, does everyone know what a pilot is for a television show? Sort of have to go out and make a whole movie, you know, like sometimes a 2-hour, right, in which you establish all the characters and you kind of tell the whole story and you have to prove that it's going to work. And David Fincher and Beau Willimon and I were not interested in auditioning the show. We believed in it. We also felt that what happens from the writing perspective and from a creative perspective, if you have to write a pilot, then you're obligated to sort of introduce all the characters in 45 minutes, create arbitrary cliffhangers and stuff that we just didn't want to do. We knew we wanted the story to go on for a long period of time. We needed distance to tell that story. We needed space to have the relationships begin to evolve. And we wanted to start the story and go as long as it was going to go. And the only network that said, well, we like you and we like David and we thought that show was cool and we've run our data and we think people would watch it. We don't need a pilot. How many do you want to do? And we were like, we don't really talk about that. 2 seasons. And they said, okay. Now, it did not surprise me that an organization like Netflix would step up. I've been talking for about 8 years about you're going to see, whether it's Hulu or Ustream or YouTube or Amazon, these companies that have made $1 gazillion as being portholes for content. If they're going to want to compete, they're going to want to get into the content business. They're going to start wanting to make original programming. And what's been so exciting about, having them as partners is on the one hand for us creatively, because they'd never done it before, they didn't even have an office to give us notes. Like, they were like, yeah, it's great, go film it. So to be in a position where we had complete autonomy and creative control was a fantastic position to be in. Then on top of that, when you think about the distribution model and the platform of being able to, for the first time, I believe, in the history of television, never before has an entire season of a series been dropped on the first day. And what I think what's been exciting about that, as you said, a sort of paradigm change, is that, you know, people have been binging, you know, since box sets, so binging isn't new. But the notion that you don't have to wait, that you can watch the series in whatever way you want to watch it. You want to spend 10 hours smoking and drinking, as I'm sure you were. And watch it that way, you can watch it that way. You want to watch 3 episodes and not watch again for 4 weeks, you can do that. The reason I was so excited about the fact that we went to Netflix is that, to me, it also meant that maybe we were saying that we learned the lesson the music industry didn't learn. Give people what they want, when they want it, in the form they want it in, at a reasonable price, and they'll more than likely buy it and not steal it. Now, some will still steal it. But I think we can also take a little bit of bite out of piracy as well, because when you give an audience the access they want, then they're in control. And I think people love being able to be in control of how they get their entertainment.
Great. Next question.
Thank you so much for both of you for being here. And I think we could all agree that you look great in that sweatshirt. My question is more of an artistic question in terms of why you made certain choices. The first moment we meet Frank Underwood is when he kills the dog that was hid outside of his house. So I was wondering if there's a particular reason for that being the very first scene we're introduced to. I'm also curious as to why Frank and Claire never have kids, if that was intentional. And then I guess I have a third question. Will there be a third season?
Okay, 3 guys behind you are really pissed off. Yes, I will actually tell you exactly how that scene happened, which is that it started with a very, very kind of pure concept that Beau Willimon, our head writer, wanted the entrance of Frank Underwood to be out a double set of doors in a townhouse and down a set of stairs. That's how he wanted to introduce him. So he had to figure out, well, now that he's outside, what the heck's going to happen? And that's how ultimately, as we discussed it, the thing that we were looking for in that scene, and by the way, you never see the dog. You never see, there's no shot of the dog at all. But we wanted to do something in that first scene that would set the tone for a character who is both doing some, good night, who is both, oh, that's much better. Thank you for turning those on. I can actually see everybody. A character who is doing something that on the one hand might seem horrible, but on the other hand might seem incredibly kind, to put an animal out of its misery. And the whole notion of a character that will do the necessary thing, that for us was a great illustration of how to do it. And I'm almost certain that if we'd been at a regular network, boy, would we have gotten notes on that idea. We're a little concerned.
Yeah. He kills a dog.
Kills a dog in the first 5 minutes. We're a little concerned. Your second question is yes, and it was addressed in the first season, but obviously you were sleeping during that episode. About the fact that they don't have children. And as far as the season 3 goes, I do believe in just a few weeks that there'll be some sort of announcement about that. But I can't tell you.
Hi, my name's Kevin Rafferty, and I'm a senior. I was wondering how much you use the British example in portraying Francis Underwood.
I don't know, has anyone ever seen the British version of House of Cards? Have you guys watched it? Well, I can recommend it because the actor Ian Richardson had played a character named Frank Urquhart because it was a slightly different name and we didn't think Urquhart worked for the US, so we changed it to Underwood, which of course meant that the initials are still FU. Beautifully played by Ian Richardson, a very successful series, although they only did 13 episodes of that original series. I had watched it many, many years ago, and then when David Fincher and I were on the set of Social Network, and we started talking about wanting to work together as an actor and director, not just a producer and director, and then a little while later, he came and he said he heard that the rights to this British series, House of Cards, were available. And did I know it? And I said, yes, I'd seen it. My mother loved that show. He said, well, I haven't watched it. I said, well, you go watch it. I'll go watch it again. And then we came back together, and we both felt very strongly that it could translate to the United States. So is that your question? I forgot already.
You use the example of Francis.
Yeah. No, and so I watched it in order to be able to have the conversation with David, but then I didn't watch it again because while we wanted to use that original series as a kind of springboard and in a sense a foundation, we also were really determined to create our own thing. And so there were aspects of it that were quite helpful, but ultimately I just kind of tried to stay focused on what was on the page and what we were trying to create in our series.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. I had a question about your characters, the characters that you play. A lot of them are evil characters who have like ethically questionable behavior.
Watch it.
I was wondering, do you go through a mindset? How do you detach from like who you are as a person and enter these roles?
I've never been somebody who, I mean, there are times when you're shooting I would say, in a film situation, where if you're filming something that is a scene that is particularly difficult, you might have to live with a certain emotion for a couple of days. But I'm really the kind of actor that when I hang up the costume, the character, I don't bring it home. And I always like to be aware that I am playing. You know, I'm not somebody who insists people call me, you know, Mr. Vice President every day on set, because I'm Mr. Vice President. Although there are actors who are like that. And I just think, just fucking get a job.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Danny Sullivan. Thank you for being here. In your opinion, is there a single ethical character in all of House of Cards? That's what I thought. Thank you.
I don't know. It's such an interesting thing. I mean, you know, all these last number of weeks, I've been having these discussions and conversations about purity. Some people think purity is like ivory soap, or purity is like you have your principles and you're going to stand by those principles even if it destroys everything in your wake. And I think that life is not like that. It is not black and white. And sometimes it's very easy for us to do that. This is bad and this is good, whereas we all generally live in a world that's a little more gray. And it's the gray that's interesting. It's the gray where we find common ground. And so I think that there are characters in House of Cards that have enormous ethics about certain things. And there are others who don't have the same ethics about certain things. And we're discovering who these characters are as we go. As I say, I don't have all the answers. I'm still learning things about why the character is the way he is, and whether the question is, oh, was that person just born that way, and therefore we shouldn't expect there to be ethics. You know, I mean, as the years go on, we find out so many things about our great leaders that we never knew while they were alive. Would our opinions have changed of them if we'd known that? Because now we live in a world of gotcha, you know, gotcha, caught being a bad person or being a human being. So I just think that that's what interests me about the exploration of this, is that it's not the black or white. It's the stuff in the middle. It's the stuff of life.
Do you mind if I ask a follow-up question?
No.
All right. Well, how do you best make sense of that gray then? What's the best way to explore those issues?
Well, I mean, I'm exploring them in the way that I can through my profession, which is to tackle these roles and put these stories out here and let these kind of conversations, whether they're happening at home because people are watching, or they're happening in restaurants, or they're happening here. I think that's, for me, look, it's like being an actor. Sometimes you have to keep asking questions. It doesn't mean you'll come up with an answer. Very often you lead yourself down a blind alley just to find another blind alley, just to find another blind alley. It's a constant sort of struggle, and very often in terms of when you're working on particularly a film or television show, you have to make decisions very quickly about how you choose to play something, how you choose to play a scene. And sometimes you're hoping you're guessing right, because you don't have the, you know, exploration that I do when I'm doing a play, where we're coming every day and working on something and going away for 3 days and coming back and doing it again, and all of the work that does and percolates down, and how other actors' performances are changing. And that's a growing, living, alive thing, whereas in film and television, you film something over the course of a day and it goes away. And I always try to remember this. No matter how good I might be in a film, I'll never be any better. And in theater, I can be better. I can be better next Tuesday than I was last night. I can be better 2 weeks from now. That is what I love about theater so much. So I'm in the midst of the exploration myself.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Tess Rosinski, and thank you again for joining us here. So I have a little bit more complicated question. So Frank Underwood in House of Cards is sometimes considered to be courageous and empowered in what he's doing, even though it's not necessarily blasé. But for Claire and Zoe, sometimes they're portrayed as a little more unhinged, daring, risky. Their behavior is not felt as like planned out or as empowered, but a little bit more dangerous. And do you think that women in politics today are subject to that double standard? And if so, why?
I'm literally trying to figure out what you're asking me.
Okay, so for Claire and Zoe, sometimes they're not as like, they are considered not having planned out their bad actions as well, and also their bad actions aren't necessarily as justified. Whereas for Frank Underwood, he has this end goal in mind that is just above all else, and so that makes his, the ends justify the means. And do you think that women in politics today are subject to that double standard?
Well, it sounds to me like this is an opinion you have about the way in which these two characters are coming off, but I suspect there are people who may not agree with that opinion. It's an opinion, and that's fine. I would say, if we're going to have a level playing field, then it seems to me that everyone is subjected to the same rules of the game, whether that's in politics or in the workplace. So, yeah. How'd I do? I'm not so sure.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right. Next question.
Hi, I'm Chris. So this question is actually for Ron Klain. Kevin, I hope that's okay.
Absolutely.
I was really interested in the fact that you were both chief of staff to Gore and Biden. Those are obviously two very different characters. So if you could kind of talk about how you might be able to compare the two experiences.
Well, first of all, I want to thank anyone for asking me a question tonight. Appreciate that. Secondly, I want to say that this young man has not been one of my students in my class, but if he enrolls next term, he's getting an A. I was listening to Kevin say that Frank Underwood would be a very different kind of vice president, and that certainly is the case. I think Al Gore and Joe Biden are two people who are very different personalities, very different personas, one very introverted, one very extroverted, one who came to politics because his father was in it, one who really came to politics more on his own. But what was interesting to me was, for all their differences, the common objectives they shared, the common principles, the common ethics they shared, a belief, in conjunction with our topic tonight, that there were ethical constraints and rules that govern the pursuit of politics and power, and that they wanted their staffs to follow those rules and constraints. And so I think that on the surface you look at these two men and they're very, very different, but what motivates them, what brought them to politics in terms of the things they wanted to get done, and how they dealt with the president, how they dealt with their staffs were very, very similar. So it was easy to work for both of them, and it was obviously an honor to do so. And thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Margot. I'm a freshman. I've never felt more like a freshman in my life. So you brought up just before how the news kind of portrays might portray figures like Lincoln if he were to be president today, doing the same things he did back then. So what are both your views on the role of media in politics today? Does it expose corruption or kind of make us focus on the wrong things when we talk about politics?
Yeah, I think something fundamentally changed in the 1980s in the news business. And that's when the conglomerates decided that the news divisions should be profitable. I think that when you make the news have to be profitable, it's no longer news. And when you make the news have to compete against entertainment programs, it becomes entertainment. So I think we've lost a lot in terms of the way in which news is gathered and news is told because they have to make money. Again, I think that now, it makes me think if Edward R. Murrow were on the air now, it would be a very unique situation where people got together to discuss and to debate a political idea or an issue. Nowadays, it seems to me that people generally tune on to a channel to hear their own opinions voiced back at them again and again and again. And the chance for real discourse and real discussion that is, again, not about ideology, has been eroding year after year after year after year in terms of the way that the news is presented. It's disappointing to me.
I guess what I'd add to that is I do think we're at an interesting pivot point in the democratization of news. And we experienced this firsthand in the Obama campaign in 2012 in the first presidential debate. So I've worked on presidential debates all the way back to 1992, and one thing you do is you carefully work during the debate to try to spin the reporters and try to persuade the reporters that your candidate won the debate and made a good point, and so on and so forth. And in the middle of that first debate in Denver, when the Twittersphere had decided that Obama had been crushed in the debate, there was really nothing we could do. We had a bunch of spinners sitting around unable to spin because millions of Americans, and what was then the largest political event ever on Twitter, had all voted, and they'd voted we had lost the debate. And that opportunity through social media, particularly for people of your generation, to influence politics, to influence the news, to discipline and shape the news, to deal with some of the things Kevin mentioned, I think is an interesting and powerful twist, and something that politicians and political figures need to deal with. We had to come to the second and third debate with strategies to deal with social media, to engage the Twitter sphere, to rally them behind President Obama, and we did, and he won the second and third debate. But I think there's a new opportunity for more people to be voices in this dialogue and to influence news coverage than there was, and hopefully that will curb some of the things that Kevin talked about.
This is for both of you. Please don't judge me. I'm just playing the devil's advocate, and it might be from my experience only understanding politics since 1994, or however long I've been alive. But to what extent do you think ethics exist in politics, and to what extent is the concept of an ethical person or image a political tool?
Well, you know, I understand why you have that question, and I'm not going to judge you because I think it's a commentary on what you see very often, and a sad commentary on that. But I do think there are ethics in politics, and I will tell you over the course of my 30 years working in politics, I've worked with enormous number of people who are moved and governed by all the right things, even when no one's looking and even when it's not to their advantage. And so I understand why there are disappointments and why there are political figures who disenchant us and who disappoint us. But I do believe the vast majority of people, and I don't mean just necessarily people I agree with, I mean both Democrats and Republicans, both liberals and conservatives, are in politics for the right reason and do so in an ethical way every day.
Yes, I do believe I've known over the years a number of pretty extraordinary people whose ethics were never in question to me. But I also think your other point about do people use it as a tool? Oh, of course. You know, we have people trying to shape the opinion of their base on whether or not they're a certain, you know, whether they believe in a certain thing and whether they support a certain idea. And very often I find myself feeling like I genuinely don't believe that you really believe that, but I believe that you're saying that because you want to, by using the media and using sound bites and using all sorts of things, create an image of yourself as an ethical person. And, you know, the great thing is that all you guys are the ones that can vote them in or vote them out. So it's your ethics.
Thank you. So I've kept Kevin longer than I promised. Maybe
That's
one
all right.
more
We'll do a few more.
Okay.
Hello, thank you both for coming out. My name is Evan Sweeney. Mr. Spacey, I'm a huge fan of your work, so it's an honor to be here.
Thank you.
I have an artistic question for you. Over the course of your career, it's been so diverse in the terms of how you've done things. You've done television, you've done live stage acting, you've done movies. I was wondering if there was a certain format that you could appreciate and or enjoy the most. And as you go forward with your career, if you think you'll find yourself gravitating towards one or all.
Well, thank you very much. I feel like the luckiest guy alive because I've been able to have the most extraordinary career, the most incredible challenges, and working with really remarkable artists in the theater and in film. If I were to have to say, well, I prefer the experience of doing the living theater because, as I said earlier, it is I guess maybe the only analogy that I sometimes use that people understand is sometimes people go, well, don't you get bored doing a play every night? You know, it's the same play. And I go, no more than if I was playing tennis 8 nights a week. It's, yeah, the same rules, and you got to get the ball into the same, you know, but it's a different game every time you're out on that court. It's new every time. And there is also something which can't be underestimated in terms of the experience, which is the act of being watched changes it. I mean, if you went out tonight and you played tennis with a friend of yours and you just went to a park and it was just the two of you, that's one kind of game. But if you went out to a park and 12 of your classmates came with you and they were drinking beers on the side, that's a different kind of game. There is the act of being watched and the relationship that you have with an audience that can be an extraordinary, alive experience. I also think that I've learned over a long period of time that the mediums of theater and film are very different in that film is the director's medium and the editor's medium, and theater is the actor's medium. You know, when you film a movie or a series and you're doing multiple takes and multiple scenes, and there's just thousands and thousands and thousands of feet of film, and someone's going to come in and take that little performance you did from that angle and the way you said that line, and then take that one, the next line slightly different, and then, you know, they are shaping your performance in a way that you have no control over at all. In a sense, I've given them all of the colors, and it's their painting. They're going to put it together in a way that I don't have much relationship to. Whereas in the theater, I get to start at A and go all the way to Z, and it's all my choices, and it's all the way I want to portray and have that experience happen for an audience and for myself. So for me, my primary allegiance has always been the living theater, and I think it always will be.
All right, thank you so much.
You.
It's a pleasure.
Hello, my name is Mariana. I'm a senior at Georgetown, and this question is geared for both of you. Mr. Spacey, I'm a huge fan. I love House of Cards, so I'm a little nervous. But I wanted to ask you both about the role of women in politics. In House of Cards, I think the woman who has the highest possible rank in the show is Linda, who's the chief of staff for the president. So my question to you is, do you think that in the next possible election, there is a possibility that we could see a woman president? And if we do you think that Congress is actually ready for a woman president, given that we've seen the tensions that have come up with our first African-American president in Congress? Do you think that similar tensions may arise if we were ever in that situation where the first woman, like Hillary Clinton, became president?
Well, kind of like, maybe. I'll say this, if Congress isn't ready, they better fucking get ready.
And Kevin, could you answer that question with a Bill Clinton impression? Because Kevin does the best Bill Clinton impression.
Let me tell you this. I hope she does run. Because then I get to be the first husband. How about that?
I agree with all that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you both for being here today.
Oh, thank you for coming.
I love you, Bill. So I absolutely love House of Cards, but I also know a lot of people who are very idealistic about the political change they want to cause. And so a question for both of you, do you think there's any danger in politics being portrayed in such a negative light in popular media? Do you think it could just exacerbate negative stereotypes people already have? Or are you more optimistic? Do you think it could cause change and maybe even raise the moral code because of this harsh lens being shined upon politics and politicians in DC?
Jesus Christ, you're going to have your own talk show in like 5 seconds, aren't you?
Thank you.
Jesus, I can't construct a fucking sentence, and that was just like, are there cue cards for you? Where? There's
right
your
there,
power in women
teleprompter
in
behind
politics
you.
right there. It's a good look. It's a really good question, and it's probably a question that's been going on for a very long time because if you look at, for example, most of Shakespeare's great plays, they are about power, and whether that power is royal power or political power or people trying to, gain power. These questions have been going on for a long time. And I do think that it's a great thing when someone's at that crossroads of a decision. Will I do this or will I do this? Will I listen to this little angel or Frank Underwood on my shoulder? That's a very interesting dilemma for all of us. We can talk about it in a sort of big and general way about what are other people going to do. But at the end of the day, it's down to what we're going to do. What decision am I going to make that's going to be a good decision or a bad decision, and not just necessarily a good decision for me? To me, that's the thing that every politician faces. Anyone that goes into the work of government or the work of wanting to do public policy, that's a great thing when you get to that place. And I wish I could say, yes, everyone's going to make the right choice. But even sometimes the wrong choice, from an outsider's point of view, leads to it's like our sort of tagline, which is bad for a greater good. Yeah, there are times when you got to do something sneaky to get something done that's worth getting done. So do the ends justify the means? Maybe.
Yeah, well, look, I think that I don't think that anyone in politics does anything bad because they see Frank Underwood do it on TV. But what I do think is we have 700 people here in Gaston Hall tonight having this conversation because our popular culture engages us in thinking about these questions in a way that if I were standing at that lectern and going through my notes on the Ethics in Government Act, it probably wouldn't draw the same crowd. And so I think it's great that a show like House of Cards puts these questions before us and makes us think about these questions and think about the answers. But I think the answers come from us, not from aping the behavior we see the actors on House of Cards do.
Definitely fair. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I've got a question for.
You're phenomenally tall.
I know.
It's
This
just-
is too low.
Sorry, that mic
You
is
need a
so
tall
short.
assistant by any chance? So first to you, sir. I'm wondering. The one thing I really took away from House of Cards was you have that scene right at the beginning, which kind of sets up the whole story, where Frank is really disappointed by the president because he's not getting the position. And my question to you is, to what extent is he actually a victim of circumstance? Because he then kind of, to me, comes to realization by just if I just keep doing things the way I used to do them, I'm not going to get where I want to go. So I'm just going to do whatever it takes now. And then as a follow-up to you, sir, I'm wondering, do you feel like the political system actually might corrupt people that previously come in with good intentions and then see they can't actually get shit done, as you said earlier? Thank you.
Thank you. Did you have a question? Because it seemed like a really nice comment, but I don't know what your question was.
So my question to you was, to what extent you think that Frank Underwood is victim of circumstance in that the story makes him do the things he didn't previously think about doing?
Yeah, no, I think he reacts, and he is believes himself to be very attuned to the way that other people will react to things he does. And that's a very interesting kind of person to deal with. That's all you get. Sorry.
And I guess what I would just say is, I'm torn about this question of whether or not the system makes people into bad actors or they're merely bad actors who wind up in the system. I think there's no question, as Kevin alluded to earlier, that the tremendous influence that money has in our political system right now is a corrupting influence. And if it doesn't make people act unethically, it certainly makes people take time that they want to spend working on solving our problems and spend that time instead raising money. And whether that's unethical or simply unfortunate, it's a bad thing. And that's a bad thing about our system, no question about it. I do think, though, on the other hand, as I said earlier, we have an enormous number of people in our system who act ethically and act morally and act for all the right reasons. And so the system's not corrupting those folks. And so I think it's too much of a cop-out just to blame it on the system and not hold people individually accountable for their actions. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, one more question, then we're going to get Kevin out of here.
Hello, my name is Anton. I'm from the Center of Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. I'd like to thank you for the lecture tonight. I haven't had the privilege of watching House of Cards, unfortunately. I have two questions which are very different. The first question is about whether it is possible to develop ethical guidelines for foreign military interventions, because obviously we don't want Hitler running, a new Hitler kind of trying to spark a Third World War, but on the other hand, we don't want to spend even more money on wars. And my second question, which as I said is very different from my first, was your character in American Beauty in a way punished for his attitude towards life, do you think, or was he just a random victim of circumstances?
I'll answer the last question first because it's an interesting question, because it seems like you're making a moral judgment about Lester Burnham, that somehow he got what he deserved. I would say that I think what I loved about Lester was that he got to a point in his life where he just couldn't stand the bullshit anymore, and he did something about it. And if that means his view of the world, in the end, I think, as I think he, if I remember it all, he's quite peaceful in looking back at his life. So I would say no to that one. And the other one, you were asking me about Hitler? I don't really
I was just asking
know.
about whether it's possible, actually, to develop ethical guidelines for foreign military interventions. I mean, when should the United States intervene?
Well, it seems to me that's, you know, we supposedly have a system of government in which those issues are discussed by Congress and discussed by Senate, and decisions are made. Obviously, we've had presidents who have gone to war without that, and we've had those that have gone to war with it. But I don't think we should ever go.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, the program says I'm supposed to make closing remarks, and so I will do it very briefly. I first came to Gaston Hall 34 years ago this fall as a freshman at Georgetown University. And I came here because I wanted the opportunity to have a first-rate academic instruction in government and politics and the chance to have hands-on experiences here in Washington. And I have been incredibly lucky in those 34 years to be able to have both. First as a student here at Georgetown, and then as an alumnus who spent a lot of my career in public service, and for the past few years as an adjunct member of the faculty in the government department. And over those 34 years, I've seen great ups and great downs, had successes and failures, and often struggled with the questions we've been talking about tonight. How far will you go to win a political campaign? How far will you go to get a bill passed? How far will you go to win a political fight? How far will you go when the presidency of the United States is on the line in the courts in Florida? And what I can say is I'm certainly not naive about that, and I've certainly seen all sides of that. But what I took away from Georgetown is something I still believe 34 years later, that there are ethical standards in politics and policy, that most people in those systems observe those all the time, most of the time, and all of them should all the time. And I believe that one reason why at Georgetown we have a government major, not a political science department, is because as important as scientific and analytical rigor is in policymaking, and it is important, that we believe that politics and policy also involve morality, ethics, philosophy, and humanity. And I believe that that's what we're teaching here at Georgetown. And I believe that at Georgetown we believe that there's not just an opportunity to serve, but an obligation to serve. And that service comes not just with ambition, but also with a commitment to acting ethically and morally. And I believe most of all, that's what we mean when we say, with pride and passion, we are Georgetown. And so on behalf of Georgetown and the government department, and my personal favorite Hoya who's with me here tonight, my college girlfriend who 27 years later is my wife, yes, it can happen to you. I just want to ask you all to join me once more in thanking our very special guest tonight, Kevin Spacey. Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you for doing this.